So what is it like being bilingual, eh? People often look at bilingualism like a useful skill, only see the positives. Wow, you speak French as well. It's pretty cool. Say something in French. Yeah, you can speak two languages. It's useful. It can be helpful for when you go on holiday. And that's kind of it. Cool. You speak two languages. But what I think people don't really understand is how it actually feels, how it can feel different. It's not purely about the language. The same if you're learning English. You're not just internalizing the language and the rules. There are more things that come into play. It affects how you think, how you communicate, how you see the world, and even how you see yourself. But what are the hidden elements of growing up bilingual? What things do you not know about my experience? And this isn't just about people who grew up bilingual. Even if you're learning English as an adult, especially to a high level, you'll probably recognize some of these things in yourself as well. The main thing I think that people get wrong about bilinguals is that there are only benefits. In my case, my mum is unfortunately French. So I grew up with her speaking a lot of French to me, which was great, honestly. I went to school in England. I grew up in England, but my mum would speak French to me. I would go on holiday to France every year. I would spend whole summers in the south of France with my family who didn't really speak English, or they didn't try, and the same during the Christmas holidays. So it wasn't something that I learned later in life. It wasn't a language that I picked up at school in my teens. It wasn't one that I decided that I had to learn for work. It was something that was integrated into my life from the very beginning. And that can affect you in different ways. So like I said, I would have summers and Christmas in France, only speaking French, pretty much the whole time. So it wasn't school French until I was about 12. It was real life French. But how is it conventionally a bit different? Normally people think that if you're bilingual, you know both languages equally. No difference. You communicate exactly the same way. You don't have any difficulties once you reach adulthood at least. But that's not the reality for most people, especially when their schooling is in one language and their lives are pretty much in one language. It's usually not going to be exactly equal. At least it wasn't for me and other multicultural people that I've come across in my life. My best friend, French, he lived the first couple of years in France, moved to England at a very young age, and then didn't return. And his English is better than his French. A number of other kids my age, more or less, who also had at least one French parent, were great at French, but their French was still worse, or much worse than their English. Identical levels is very much the exception. So in English, I can speak very well about pretty much everything. In French, there have always been gaps. There are bigger gaps now because I don't use it. But what people don't see is your actual experience using that second language in real situations, especially when you don't speak it to the level of your other native language. You have just the same struggles as anyone else, except for the expectation that you should be able to speak that language to a native level. And if you've ever felt in English like you know what you want to say, but you just can't get the words out, you can't find the right phrasing, you can't find the right words, the person you're speaking to is speaking ever so fast or with such a strong accent you didn't quite catch what they said. You felt exactly the same way bilinguals felt over and over and over again. But then what about the question, can you think in both languages? Do you ever get mixed up? Do you dream in French? Well, for me, growing up, I think it helps, but I distinguish between the languages very well. I don't get confused between the two languages. Maybe I think a bit more now, oh, that's an English word. I think it's a French word, right? But really, I transition between the two very well. C'est très facile. Oui, 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 c'est très facile, hein? But typically, and I don't think it was always this way, but it takes me like a bit of time to lubricate the chains, because I can be a bit rusty in French. Because if you go like months and months and months without using any French, without thinking French, you need a bit of lubrication. So I need to get into the right gear. It might take me a couple of days to really be functioning at sort of the best of my capabilities. But the switch is very automatic. I basically don't translate ever in French. I'm just thinking French, except for when I can't find the word now. Before I could translate like a madman. But I digress. So, in spite of the fact that I grew up with French and I use French a lot, though I don't use it so much anymore, there is still that warm-up period. There are still those days when my brain's like, what's that word again? Another thing is switching between languages. For me, at least these days, because I don't practice French so regularly, I need a little warm-up when I arrive. And if you've ever had a break from English and you get back into it, You probably recognize that feeling. Where are the words? I'm speaking slower. So, being bilingual or just speaking another language isn't just about knowing the words. It actually changes how you think, how you express yourself, and often how you feel. If you ever felt a bit different when speaking English, or a bit less like yourself, in my opinion, that's completely normal. It's not you, it's the language. Because I feel French a lot. But then comes the interesting question. Are you a different person in English than in French? Good one. Good one to ponder on. In my experience, the earlier you integrate a language into your life, the less it should impact your overall personality, where it's like you're two distinct people, especially when the environments that you're using each of the languages in aren't so different. Take being from a foreign country and learning English as a foreign language as a teenager only in the classroom, nowhere else, maybe online, compared to your own native language where you're using it all the time. You're using it in the classroom, you're using it at home, you're using it in the playground, using it for extracurricular activities, using it in all kinds of environments, on holiday as well. So you pick up the language in all kinds of environments. Then take into consideration the fact that you're interacting with a variety of people, friends, families, also teachers, strangers, everybody. But in the classroom, you're only interacting with teachers and kind of with friends a little bit. You're going to be a little bit different. Or as an extension to that, you learn English in school, but then you move abroad to England and you build your life there. You start to meet new people, make new friendship groups. Naturally, from interacting with this group of people compared to this group of people, you're going to be a little bit different, right? So that's where the people can affect your personality as well as the new environment. So I'd probably say in French, I'm a bit more polite, a bit more careful depending on the person. And in English, I feel quicker, more natural, more expressive in terms of the vocabulary that I can use. But here's the reality of communicating in a second language. One of the biggest difficulties will be the limits of your vocabulary. If you don't have the words, if you can't express yourself fully, you're going to feel that you might seem a bit quieter or less funny or less confident. Not because you are, but because you can't show it in that language yet. And I think a lot of people learning English feel exactly the same way and don't always realize why. But an interesting thought, something to ponder on, something to think about. In my opinion, it can be easier to express certain emotions in another language, not because you feel them more, but because the language feels a bit more distant. In your main language, there's a lot of history attached to it. Certain words can feel quite strong, quite heavy, depending on your experiences. Whereas in another language, those same words feel a bit lighter. Take I love you, for example. In English, for me personally, that feels very strong and I'm extremely selective about who I say it to. And it's quite similar with je t'aime in French for me. It feels quite strong but toned down a bit. Whereas if I say in Spanish, like te amo, feels more fun, more light. I could tell anybody that. Those things can just be a bit easier to say. And I think sometimes, it can make it easier to express things that you would normally avoid in your first language, to express more appreciation, to be more open and say something a bit more emotional because there's much less weight behind it. And if you're learning English, you might have felt this before without noticing it. Like when you use all the swear words from the films that you've heard, you can just do it for fun. It sounds cool. There might not be that big sense of rudeness behind the words. Whereas in your own language, saying those same words and expressions would be a big no-no. But as an aside, I didn't actually take to French very well. I didn't like French. I couldn't be bothered with it a lot of the time, apart from when I was on holiday with my cousins, with my family, and talking with them was easy. But when I was in England, it was like, why are we speaking French? I even remember answering so many times in English when my mum asked me stuff in French. It didn't feel right. I don't know how else to put it. But funnily enough, there were two distinct moments, typically when I would be using French in England. One was if I was in trouble and I wanted to get out of trouble with my mum, I'd be using French to butter her up. And two was if it was like a secret communication with my mum, whether it was something embarrassing or something that we wanted to keep a bit separate. I would speak to my mum in French when I was maybe with friends or maybe at school or wherever, somewhere where there are other English people when I didn't want them to hear, when we didn't want them to understand, we'd default to French. But most of the time it was actually not necessarily the most pleasant thing. I think that's part of the language learning experience of it. It's difficult. It's just easier to speak in your first language. And even if it's a language that you grow up learning at home, it can still feel like, oh, really? Especially as a kid. Therefore, it's bloody obvious why you, learning English later on, find it so taxing, so effortful. So it's not necessarily very simple, but you do have a sense of another identity. And then if you're placed in the other environment, also in France, I didn't quite feel fully French. I wasn't going like, oui, 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 ooh la la, sacré bleu. I did have a small English accent. There was some slightly less natural phrasing to my French, where I felt like the French guy growing up in England. Back in England, I felt like the English guy who's kind of French. So there is that kind of clash of identities, identifying yourself who you are, which can be one of the biggest issues to face, and something you've got to come to terms with, where you're kind of from both worlds, and feeling like you're from both worlds can feel like you're from none as well at the same time. And that's where I think most people don't fully get what it's like to be bilingual. People only see the success. They only see the benefits and the positives to it. They don't see the other side. They're like, that's cool, you can speak 2 languages, man. I wish I could. But in reality, you've got all the effort. You've got the embarrassment of making mistakes. You've got the limitations to your speech. There's a lot more going on that people don't realize. And this brings us back to, is it worth being bilingual? Is it worth learning a second language? Do I like being bilingual? Do I like being multicultural? Well, it's obviously a huge advantage in some senses. Honestly, it's so worth it. Personally, I could get to know my grandparents, my uncles, aunties, cousins really well because we could talk. If I didn't know French, I wouldn't have been able to communicate with them properly and therefore not get to know them as deeply as I have. Obviously, I've got the ability to potentially work in France or work with French companies, go abroad to France and be able to talk with French people in French. But it's not without its downsides, obviously. Language learning is hard, but it can open up your mind to new perspectives, new ways of doing things, new worlds. So it's obviously a skill to learn that's massively beneficial, but it's not just a skill. It shapes how you think, your outlook on the world, the way you communicate, the way that you get on with people, the way that you can understand people, and how you see yourself. Like I said, you might have a clash of identities. Who am I? How you orient yourself in the world. Obviously that's different as a bilingual, where you identify yourself as both, compared to someone who learns English in their teens or in their adulthood. Your identity's already been formed, it's been molded, so there's less of that downside, but then potentially more of that embarrassment, more awareness of those limitations, lower confidence, maybe because of that separation between your identity and that of the people whose language you're trying to learn. You can feel that gap much more, which could affect those factors. So when it comes to bilingualism, you're not just learning that other language, you're learning another culture, you're learning about another people, you're learning another outlook on life, which is amazing. It opens your mind up to a different reality of how things could be, of how people can see things in different ways. But don't think that it's all rosy being bilingual, that it's all positives, no negatives. Not to say that it's really tough and to give me emotional support because of the trauma that it caused me. No, but it's not easy. Learning another language is impressive. It's difficult. It takes time and willpower. But anyway, that's enough about me. Hope you enjoyed the video. Obviously, like, subscribe, whatever. See you in the next one.